you should receive all the authorizations request and everything. Okay, so great. Okay, so thank you much for accepting our invitation for this seminar. My name is Giovanni Bernardini. I'm a researcher at the University of Verona and a member of the Center for European Studies, which organized these seminars. This is part of the Spring 2024 seminars, Migrations, Exile, and Anti-Fascism, which is 3 core subjects of our center. And as I told you, we are recording the seminar and we are streaming on YouTube. Today we have the pleasure to have Daniel Goldstein with his seminar on Italian anti-fascism in Mexico, 1922-1946, a comparative and transnational perspective. Just a very short presentation. Daniel has earned his PhD at the University of Rome, Tor Vergata, and the focus of his thesis was the Italian anti-fascism in Mexico. He was awarded 2 scholarships by Cornell University and by the Neal Center for Labor Management Documentation and Archives. And he has been publishing on this subject on Italian anti-fascism migration in Mexico from different points of view. And today we have 2 discussants. One is Enrico Acciai. Enrico Acciai is member of the board of the Center for European Studies and is professor in contemporary history at the University of Rome, Tor Vergata. He was a recipient of a Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellowship in 2016, and he has been visiting scholar in many universities like Copenhagen, Leeds, Santander, and Florence. He has published 4 books devoted to the Italian Civil War, the Garibaldi's Legacy on War Volunteering, on anti-fascism and the Spanish Civil War, and on anarchism. Hugo Garcia Fernandez, thank you, is professor of history at the Universidad Autònoma de Madrid since 2010, and he has received the prize for his PhD thesis. Is part of a group de investigación de historia social y cultural contemporánea y del grupo de investigación complutense de la Guerra Civil y del Franquismo. He's been working on several topics of 20th century history of Spain, Europe, and Latin America, and he has published books and many articles in international journals on the mobilization of British public opinion during the Spanish Civil War, on rethinking the category of anti-fascism in a global perspective, and on Spanish utopias. So I thank you all 3 for accepting our invitation. First, I give the floor to Daniel for a 40-45 minutes presentation. Then our 2 discussants will have between 10 or 20 minutes for their comments and questions. Thank you very much. So now you can share your screen, please. Thank you.
Okay. Make sure this works again. Share. Can you see it?
Sure.
And then I think now. Okay, so let me start by thanking everyone, the Center for European Studies, Professor Kamuri for inviting me, also, of course, Professor Bernardini for all the organizational efforts, and thank you, of course, to the 2 discussants for being here today. The topic that I'm going to speak about for the next 40 minutes or so, Italian anti-fascism in Mexico, is, I imagine, something that you probably haven't heard all that much about. And there's a good reason for that. This was a relatively modest exile. We're talking about a few hundred people over the course of 20 years. And correspondingly, the historiography on this topic is also quite brief. There were a couple of articles in the mid-1990s on the topic, one by Fanesi, another by Minerbi, that dealt with the communist side of this exile. There was an interesting brief article by Michele Presuto in 2011 that dealt with the early years and a protagonist that we're going to get to, Giovanni Leone Castelli. And then there were other books and articles that sort of treat it in a tangential way, including an article by Professor Acciai. Nevertheless, I think that the topic is worthy of further historiographical investigation for a couple of reasons. First, because it's an interesting case study of Italian anti-fascism in a peripheral location. So away from the Italian immigrant masses of New York or Buenos Aires or São Paulo or France for that matter. And as such, there are different strategies employed by this small community. And the one that I'm going to focus on perhaps the most is the way in which they attempted to leverage the greater resources of the larger exile communities. And as they did that, they often attempted to shape the way they told their story to make resistance to fascism part of a more global struggle against oppression of various kinds. I also think that the case of Mexico is interesting because of the emergence of the Alianza Garibaldi. It's a group that gets relatively little attention, but it was perhaps in the Americas, at least, the main ideological rival of the Mazzini Society and Italia Libre, as it contested the idea that communists should be excluded from these broad anti-fascist fronts. And third, as the 2020 book by Aribert Reimann has really made clear, Mexico City was in the late 1930s and 1940s a major hub for political exiles of the transnational left. The case of Trotsky obviously being the first big one, and then the 20,000 or so Spanish Republicans being perhaps the most important. And Italian anti-fascists in this milieu did make important contributions to the various conversations and debates that were going on at the time. I want to say just a word or two about the sources that I used in this investigation. Much of this was done, as was mentioned, as part of my doctoral thesis, which was done during the time of COVID. So it is perhaps a slightly less systematic approach and a little more of attempting to stitch together lots of small pieces of information. Nevertheless, the most important sources were probably the Casellario Politico Centrale in Rome, the Mexican archives. There is the immigration files of the Departamento de Migraciones, also the Dirección de Investigaciones Políticas y Sociales, and then U.S. Surveillance files from the Office of Strategic Services and the Department of State Central Decimal files. I want to say just a word or two about Mexico in the early 20th century, because it's a topic that receives relatively little attention outside of Mexico itself, certainly in the United States, in my country. First and foremost, I want to point out that Mexico was not a major recipient of European economic migration. By 1930, the number of Italians in the country was certainly not more than 10,000, even using the most generous definition of who is an Italian. And those that were there were reasonably well integrated and reasonably privileged. Should also be pointed out that though fascism in an organized way arrived to Mexico rather late, the first fasci were started in 1927, there was, with the help of the diplomatic corps, they did do a pretty good job of converting much of the colonia to fascism. Okay, but as can be seen from this quote by a couple of the leaders of the Alianza Garibaldi, these are not, however, ferocious fascists, but rather people who have confused Italy with the current Italian government, be that what it may. So essentially what you're talking about is a large number of people sort of joining the fasci and the Casa d'Italia, but treating it more as a social opportunity and less as an ideological political commitment. The legazione, legation, which was at the time the Italian diplomatic representation in the country, which didn't yet have embassy status, was not particularly repressive in regard to anti-fascists in the country, certainly not in comparison with what was seen in other places. Probably should say at least a word about the Mexican Revolution, which sort of generally the starting point for any discussion of Mexican history in the first half of the 20th century. This was a 10-year multi-part civil war, which put an end to the 35-year dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, costing the lives of about 2 million people in the process. It left the Constitución de 1917, which was one of the world's most progressive and secular at the time. It also, over the course of about 10 years of consolidation, left a very centralized political system. I don't want to try to get too deep into the various Mexican administrations that were in power during the period we're studying, but at least a word or two should be said. The Calles administration and the various smaller administrations known as the Maximata, which followed, could not really be termed anti-fascist in any way, though they did collaborate with the Italian anti-fascists when the benefit was mutual. As has been shown in several other articles, there was, as you know, a religious uprising, the Cristero War going on from 1926 to 1929 against the Calles government. And this coincided in time with the fascist regime negotiating the Patti Lateranense with the Catholic Church. So not surprisingly, Mexico and its government were portrayed extremely negatively in the Italian press. Fundraising campaigns were even organized in Italy to help the rebels. And as such, Italian anti-fascists saw an opportunity there to endear themselves to the local government, and it was a successful move on their part. By 1934, the Cardenas government was openly anti-fascist, was one of the main proponents of sanctions over Ethiopia, aided the Spanish Republic, and most importantly, accepted a very large number of Spanish Republican refugees. The Avila Camacho government was more pro-Allied, more moderate, as a national unity government, but continued in some ways the policy of exile, although visas became more difficult to obtain as time went on. And the other thing we should reiterate again is that Mexico City of the late 30s and 40s was certainly a haven for left-wing political exiles. Trotsky, the Spanish Republicans, as we said, but also there were German communists, at least several hundred of them, and Central European communists, which played a quite important role in the pro-Soviet side of the exile. And there was also some number of Central and South American radicals, as had been the case in Mexico for quite a long time. And the reason I stress this so much is because the presence of these people guaranteed the existence of a large number and wide variety of political parties, of aid organizations, of newspapers, magazines, publishing houses that were largely on the political left and geared towards a Eurocentric audience. As Aribert Reimann has been quoted, Mexico City at the time was one of the most prominent and productive geographical locations for international networks of left-wing politics, literature, and arts outside the Soviet Union. So I guess I'll sort of proceed in some ways chronologically. Although there are some instances of collaboration between Italian anti-fascists and local groups that could be considered certainly against fascism as early as 1924, Tina Modotti being an important example with participating in the Mexican Communist Party. It wasn't until about 1926, 1927 that groups really began to organize themselves in a more structured way. The two most significant were the Alianza Antifascista and the Lega Internazionale Antifascista. The Alianza was organized around an ex-fascist and ex-denuncian legionnaire named Nanni Leone Castelli, who arrived in Mexico in about 1925 after having had a number of misadventures in Fiume, He was in New York collaborating with Luigi Barzini on a pro-fascist newspaper. He then had another ultra-nationalist newspaper in Canada when he had to flee the United States. And he eventually went back to Italy again, for personal reasons in 1925, but was very disillusioned with fascism and when he saw it in up close and personal, and arrived in Mexico in 1925 as the most outspoken anti-fascist in the country. It took him a couple years to create the Alianza Antifascista, which really had a couple of functions. One was publishing anti-fascist propaganda, attempting to contest the official propaganda that was coming out of the diplomatic corps. It published a monthly called Italia Libre, but it had much more success when collaborating with local organizations. El Sol, which was the paper of the CROM labor union, then Mexico's most important, published at least 25 vehemently anti-fascist articles by Leone Castelli in 1926 and 1927. And these were generally around the idea of exposing fascist lies. They had titles such as The Situation of the Workers in Italy, which attempted to discuss the actual levels of wages and hours, working day, et cetera, et cetera. The second strategy they had, which was interesting, was intervening directly with the Mexican government. And it seems that their contact, the conduit, was furnished through Freemasonry, an important individual called Luis Manuel Rojas, who was the president of the 1917 Constituent Assembly at Querétaro. And through these channels, they managed to get a clandestine fascist newspaper canceled called Italia Nova after only a couple of episodes. And they also managed to get a lecture series at the National University by the Italian commercial attaché, also canceled. The third thing they did was holding public events, not unlike most other groups. And what was interesting about this, though, was the way in which they attempted to link Italian anti-fascism with sort of Mexican liberal traditions, sort of broadly defined. And the best example of this was the annual celebration of the 20th of September, in which they would have a two-part celebration. First, in front of the Garibaldi statue in Avenida Chapultepec, and then they would have a second part in front of the statue of Benito Juarez in the Alameda Central. Similarly, they attempted to internationalize the threat of fascism when commemorating, for example, the anniversary, I think the third anniversary of the murder of Giacomo Matteotti. They were telling the assembled populace that Mussolini had secret henchmen and assassins fanning out across America. I mean, I'm sure this was a bit exaggerated, but nevertheless, that was always their intention, was to sort of make their struggle part of a bigger struggle. The other group that was somewhat important in this time was the Lega Antifascista, which was communist inspired. And it was founded by a little-known individual called Giuseppe Sala, who quickly sort of ceded the leadership to more established anti-fascists. Vittorio Vidali and Tina Bodotti played a leading role. And this group was unable to collaborate with the local government, and instead did so with local and regional communist and sort of communist-leaning organizations, such as the Mexican Communist Party, the Liga Antiimperialista de las Americas, and something even as Manos Fuera de Nicaragua was also a collaborator of theirs. Sort of foreshadowing what will happen in the war years, there was not any sort of collaboration between the communist group and the non-communist group. In fact, they were busy denouncing one another. El Machete, the publication of the Mexican Communist Party, was denouncing Leone Castelli as a secret fascist who had only turned to anti-fascism after being denied high-level posts in the diplomatic corps. And Castelli responded by writing to the Secretaría de Gobernación, warning that foreign communist elements were infiltrating Mexico and defaming its government. But here's the thing about these two groups. When you actually try to reconstruct who the members were, and this is something I've tried to do in all of my research in this way, is to, when you look at the actual membership, there were a lot of the same people. So rather than two compact groups fighting one another, a group of communists and a group of radical socialists, what you really have are two very small nuclei of leaders contesting the same membership, many of whom don't see a substantial difference between the two and join up for both. I just want to, if I have enough time, say one or two words about a third group at the time called Alma Mater Roma, which appears nowhere in the historiography at all. I've seen a number of references to it, however, in the Casellario Politico Centrale and files involving different people. It was a weird collaboration between three very dissimilar individuals. One was a sort of occultist and sort of a Freemason named Aldo Lavagnini, who was the cousin of Spartaco Lavagnini, who had been essentially part con man and convinced a small number of Italians to migrate to Mexico illegally, all while sending him money for a Masonic society that he proposed to build. Of course, this didn't work out as planned. Also, Leopoldo Carotti, who was a Republican journalist who had come to Mexico after fleeing the United States, and who would ultimately die a few years later in Venezuela, attempting to join with a local uprising. And then also Jose Allen of the Mexican Communist Party. So this was a small scale group that didn't seem to amount to very much, but I thought maybe it should just be mentioned for a moment. The early 1930s, all these groups tend to lose significance in the early 1930s. And the sort of common thread I see is that it was a dispersion of key militants around the country. A lot of the while Castelli remained in Mexico City and sort of rebranded himself as the local representative of the Unione Democratica Internazionale, which was a Paris-based group led by the socialist Ubaldo Triaca. Many of the people who were his main collaborators moved for personal reasons, work reasons, away from the capital. And that sort of was something that I saw quite often. And the Lega, on the other hand, was sort of hit by the anti-communist repressions that took place after the attack on President Ortiz Rubio. Tina Modotti, for example, was expelled from the country in 1930. By the end of the 1930s, early 1940s, however, the situation had become much more propitious for anti-fascist organization in Mexico. As we've mentioned, Cárdenas becomes president in 1934, and the Vicente Lombardo Toledano of the CTM also gains quite a lot of clout, and these are two committed anti-fascists. Similarly, as we've mentioned, the influx of left-wing political refugees from Europe. But in the Italian case, it's also important to mention the arrival of Francesco Frola, who arrives in Mexico in 1938. Frola was a reformist socialist who had some small influence in the Socialist Party in the early 1920s, was victimized by squadrismo, and fled to France in 1925, where he had a series of financial misadventures, and eventually goes to Brazil in 1926, when invited to direct La Defesa, an anti-fascist paper there. He spends about a decade bouncing around Brazil and Argentina, where he is sort of characterized as a point of contact between socialist and communist militants. He reportedly refused to collaborate with an attempt to form a Brazilian section of the Concentrazione Antifascista because communists were excluded. So he arrives in Mexico in 1928. His presence in Brazil became untenable after the consolidation of the Vargas dictatorship, and he arrives in a sort of privileged way. His exile was set up by the Mexican ambassador in Rio, and he arrives already with a job at the National University teaching economics, and very high-level contacts in the Cardenas administration. Nevertheless, his first three attempts to form an anti-fascist group all fail. They go under various names, but none of them really get any traction. And he spends the first 3 years doing a lot of anti-fascist propaganda in collaboration with Mexican labor unions, first and foremost. More generally, in the Western Hemisphere at the time, it should be mentioned that the Mazzini Society in the United States, which was the most important anti-fascist group in the United States, and Italia Libre in Buenos Aires, and also Montevideo with smaller sections elsewhere, these two groups were expressly anti-communist. As Alberto Tarchiani, the secretary of the Mazzini Society, was quoted as saying that they were interested in fighting for democracy and liberty and not for replacing one dictatorship with another. But by the second half of 1941, Molotov and Ribbentrop is over, the Soviet Union is in the war on the side of the Allies, and there does manifest some support for a wider anti-fascist alliance, even inside the Mazzini Society itself. Rodolfo Pacciardi is certainly an exponent of this, as are others such as Giuseppe Lupus, Nino Capraro. So the Alleanza Garibaldi, which I want to focus on a little bit, was founded sort of in this context in November 1941 in Mexico City by two socialists and two communists, the communists being Vittorio Vidali and Mario Montagnana, the socialists Francesco Frola, and a little-known individual called Leone Oper. So they formed this with the hope of uniting all sincere anti-fascists. I mean, that's obviously a very ambitious goal and probably somewhat unreasonable. But if you look at at sort of the tenor of the communications that they forwarded to various leaders of the Mazzini Society, to Carlos Sforza, what they were going for was not necessarily for everyone to sort of join into their organization, although I'm sure they would have loved it, but they were looking for broad-based participation in any eventual Italian organizations of a official or semi-official nature that were on the table at the time, such as an Italian National Council under Sforza, or an Italian Volunteer Legion organized by Pacciardi. All of these, as we're going to see, are going to be rebuffed by the Mazzini Society in New York. It should be mentioned that the Mazzini Society had a small section in Mexico, although it was not really politically independent and was not particularly effective. It did include the participation of Leo Valiani and a number of ex-communists, a few members of the Italian Republican Party. Perhaps its greatest accomplishment was that at midway through 1943, it managed to send a number of its members back to Italy in collaboration with the British Special Operations Executive. But back to the Garibaldi, apart from attempting to construct this anti-fascist front, it had really about four main priorities. One was combating anti-fascist propaganda in Mexico, and this was where it was probably most successful. It did manage to inject quite a lot of propaganda into the Mexican and sort of North American media space. It attempted to materially aid exiles, both those in Mexico itself with jobs and subsidies, as well as those in need of visas. This was one of its other somewhat successful priorities. After the fall of fascism in 1943, it shifted its focus towards campaigning for the right to return to Italy for political exiles. And in this regard, it was certainly an abject failure. They were unable to convince the US authorities to provide the necessary transit visas. And most of the individuals they were hoping to repatriate were stuck in Mexico until at least 1945. Another interesting thing, though, that should be mentioned is that after the fall of fascism, the Garibaldi did attempt to leverage its sort of legitimacy, its anti-fascist moral authority, on behalf of the entire Italian community in the country. So whereas they're publishing articles in their newspaper, Informazione Italiana, demanding a vigorous purge of fascists from Italian civil society, at the same time, they are sort of sticking up for people that were sort of not close to the fascist regime in Mexico itself. They do organize a committee in order to aid and eventually repatriate several hundred Italian sailors who were sequestered in Mexico with the outbreak of the war. So how did they go about pursuing these various goals? And what I've seen is the one common thread is that they attempted to leverage the larger resources of the more powerful exile communities, certainly the Spanish, but also the German, the Austrian, Jewish, and so forth, and transnational groups that were set up by a more blended group of individuals. With regard to their propaganda, they had most luck collaborating with the various publications of Vicente Lombardo Toledano, El Popular, and Futuro, but they also were publishing in El Socialista and in España Popular of the Spanish Communist Party in exile. They had a radio program on the channel of the Mexican PRM or ruling party. They participated in conferences such as those of Acción Democrática Internacional, which brought together about 92 organizations in January of 1942. And they also collaborated with, for example, Spanish Republican publishing houses, such as Editorial Seneca, which hosted 3 of the major proponents of the Garibaldi to do a conference series in about 1944. When it comes to sort of materially aiding the refugees, it's interesting. They sought visas, again, through Lombardo Toledano, but also through the Spanish socialist Carlos Esplá. And it's interesting also to note that they didn't limit these attempts to their own political partners. They also, some of their greatest sort of enemies in the Mazzini Society were people on the list that they had forwarded to Carlos Esplá, hoping to save them or their family members. Lombardo Toledano was an important partner when it came to finding jobs in Mexico. And then it should also be mentioned that they did, on some occasions, manage to get subsidies from the Spanish Republican aid organizations like the SERE and the YARE, although these were more difficult for a non-Spaniard to access and were most likely accessible to Italians that had volunteered in the Spanish Civil War. So I want to say, to this end, in order to foster these relationships, they made a very serious effort to portray their struggle against Mussolini as part of something larger. For example, this is Frolla's contribution to the Black Book of Nazi Terror in Europe, which was largely a German initiative that was also had the participation of the Mexican president Avila Camacho and the Mussolini precursor of Hitler. And similar efforts were made in many places along these lines. In this, Frolla stresses, for example, fascist designs on the Americas. This was a common theme, showing the danger to small countries like Mexico of the expansionist tendencies of Mussolini. And interestingly enough, he also likes to, they also harp on the idea of that there was foreign money involved in the origins of Mussolini. And when you read some of these things, it's not really all that different to what someone like Salvemini was saying in What to Do About Italy, trying to sort of, again, this is an attempt, I think, to sort of stand up for the Italian people in some way, to leverage their anti-fascist credentials in that direction. They also, emphasized very much Italian participation in the Spanish Civil War. This was a big theme. The Garibaldi held a celebration for the 5th anniversary of the Battle of Guadalajara. Vittorio Vidali, who was obviously an important veteran, helped to found the Sociedad de Excombatientes de la República Francisco Javier Mina. Egidio Prevedelo, another member of the Garibaldi, was involved in the League of Injured War Veterans. And this was something that I think had some success. Here is a letter, hard to read perhaps, but a letter from Luis Rivas to the Garibaldi, who was the last commander of the 12th International Brigade, where he talks about being willing to fight and die for a free Italy and paying back what was done by Italians in Spain. They also, for example, here attempt to link Italian anti-fascism to sort of Mexican liberalism, Mexican independence, etc. Here is a photo of the leaders of the Garibaldi standing as an honor guard in front of the monument to the heroes of Mexican independence. Similarly, Francesco Frola in particular published quite a lot in attestation to the progressive credentials of the Cardenas and Avila Camacho regimes in a wide variety of journals. As early as 1948, Frola was contributing to Voce degli Italiani, a communist-inspired periodical in Paris. And, you know, in the 1940s from Mexico, was publishing even in Havana, Cuba, in support of the labor practices of the labor practices of the Mexican government. It's important to specify, of course, that this wasn't entirely unique. As Andrea Akli-Kressing has shown, the German exiles also collaborated very closely with Lombardo Toledano, and she very eloquently sort of describes this vision of anti-fascism as a sort of transatlantic political culture that is broadly defined enough to encompass these ideas such as autodetermination and democracy in places like Mexico and elsewhere in Latin America. And another thing that I just want to mention that she also says in this article is how exiles lent their sort of moral authority to the local governments and regimes. And I think that's something that you will see also in the case of the Italians. However, these collaborations also had a sort of negative side to them, which I think sometimes isn't mentioned as much in the discussion of transnational anti-fascism networks. And that's many of the same people that they were so reliant upon in order to increase their reach and meet their material needs were also involved in a very bitter intra-left political struggle in Mexico. After Trotsky's murder in 1940, the persecution in Mexico of Stalin's enemies did not lessen, but rather increased. There's an interesting book by Patrick Eibert, which discusses this in the early chapters. And he stresses that the situation in Mexico for sort of anti-totalitarian refugees was so severe that the editors of the journal Analysis felt it necessary to write to the Mexican government and stress that none of them had either cardiac defects or any intention of committing suicide. By 1942, one of these individuals, Julian Gorkin, had already reported 5 attacks against his life. So some of the Garibaldi's closest allies that they were partnering with in many different ways were also complicit in the verbal and physical attacks that Stalin's allies were carrying out in Mexico against anything that was even remotely close to Trotskyism or any heterodox or apostate Marxists. For example, we mentioned earlier the Sociedad Javier Mina, but that was also founded by David Siqueiros, the author of the first attack on Trotsky's life in 1940. So the Garibaldi, in a way, faced a dilemma. Many of the partners they so needed also represented a concrete example of the brutality and injustice of Stalin's Soviet Union. So, needless to say, this desired anti-fascist unity that the Garibaldi sought was never achieved. The Mazzini Society in New York held a conference in June of 1942 in which they voted a resolution to reaffirm their their prohibition on admitting communists, and this was upheld with over 2/3 of the vote. The Montevideo Conference of Italia Libre in August of 42 also refused any communist groups and did not invite the Garibaldi. As time went on, the leaders of the Garibaldi attempted to outflank the Alberto Tarchianis and Max Zaskelis in New York by writing directly to Carlo Sforza, which was also unsuccessful, although it is interesting to show here that he did take these threats seriously. He sent these sort of urgent messages to Torquato Di Tella and to Sumner Wells to warn about the dirty tricks and dangerous Latin intrigues being launched. So I don't mean to imply that in even the best case scenario, it would have been possible for the Garibaldi to convince the Mazzini Society and liberal democratic anti-fascists to form a united front. I don't know that it would have been, but I think it should be mentioned that this collaboration on their part with some of the most repressive agents of the sort of Stalinist experiment in Mexico made the situation not better, but worse. So I think you can, their results are sort of mixed. They did manage to inject, as we said, a fair amount of anti-fascist propaganda into the media space. Mario Montagnana, the secretary of the group, summarized in 1946, while from a organizational point of view, it did not obtain any notable successes. From the point of view of agitation and defense of Italian interests, the Alleanza Garibaldi had great repercussions in many countries and carried out an extensive and clearly positive work. So sort of to conclude more generally, and I feel bad, there's a few other groups that we didn't really even mention, the small section of the Italian Socialist Party, or the Provvisorial Committee for the Italian Socialists in Exile. If anyone's interested in that, we can discuss that in questions. But to conclude, I'd say the anti-fascist exile was neither large nor unified. It did, however, produce at least one significant group, the Garibaldi, that had a significant impact upon Italian exile politics in the hemisphere. And I also want to just conclude also by mentioning Leo Valiani's article from 1982, in which he talks about anti-fascist exile more generally as a sort of political and international education. Talks about experiences that would have been impossible to obtain in Italy under fascism. And the Mexican case in that sense is somewhat interesting in that the divisions, the stark divisions that existed within the left in Mexico did in some ways prefigure the divisions of the Cold War that would be that would define the coming decades. I like this quote from the U.S., one of the U.S. Coordinator of Information from June 1942, as sort of a note to end on, when sort of coming to the inability of the Garibaldi to achieve this unity. He says, the main trouble is that the hatred which these people have for fascism is not great enough to overcome their suspicion of one another, of each other. And I think that's a good way to end. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Although I like very much this quotation, I ask you to stop sharing your.
Yeah, I'm trying. Yeah, let me figure out how to do this.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
okay. And thank you for this excellent overview. Actually, your last comments were closer to my interests, and I would have some questions, but for now I leave the floor to Enrico Acciai for his comments and questions. Then maybe we can have a little more talk later. So,
Okay,
Enrico,
perfect.
please
Okay.
open your microphone. Thank you.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you for this invitation. I mean, it's always a pleasure to be here with the Center for European Studies. Thank you to Daniel for presenting his paper, and I mean it's a pleasure to discuss this with Hugo Garcia, who is one of the reference scholar for those working on anti-fascism from a transnational and global perspective. So I have to underline from the beginning, there is a small conflict in interest here because as Giovanni was presenting before, he mentioned that Daniel did his PhD at Roma Tor Vergata. I'm working at the Roma Tor Vergata, so it's clear that I've been following Daniel's thesis at least for the last 2 years of his PhD, because I joined the department once he was already there. So, and I have to acknowledge that, he did a great job in a very tough period because it was not easy. All of us working on transnational global history, we know how complicated it was that time for doing our investigations and going to the archives. And so hopefully this period is over. So I'll make a couple of comments on his paper, starting from to underline how needed was this sort of investigation, this PhD thesis from an Italian historiographical perspective, because when we speak about the Italian historiography, mainly the Italian historiography speaking about anti-fascist exile has been focused mainly on 2 different examples. One was the most classical, France, so the anti-fascists who decided to go to France, either France or Belgium, but the stories were more or less the same. And the other big historiography that we have on anti-fascist exile has been the one on anti-fascism in the United States. And those 2 anti-fascists were quite different among them. And in Mexico City, we found a sort of third way in between these 2 examples. And it's something that has been overlooked by Italian historiography. And even if, Daniel, he has underlined, and he was always underlined that when he was doing his PhD, saying, I'm speaking about small groups. But those groups were not that small, and according to me, and on the other hand, they were able to build some very interesting transnational connections during their period in exile in Mexico. I would like to focus mainly on 2 elements and maybe ask Daniel to add some reflection if he can, if he wants. The first one is that clearly here we have 2 periods of this history. And the changing moment in this history, it's represented by the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War, has been a changing experience for anti-fascism, and this has been underlined by many historians. And what we see from the Mexican perspective, it's that the Spanish Civil War changed anti-fascism in 2 different opposite ways, but those 2 ways were there at the same time. On one way, we have a fractured anti-fascism, because we all knew how the story ended in Spain within the anti-fascist camp. If we look at the division between Stalinist and, for example, anarchist and the more libertarian part of the anti-fascist front. So we know that there was this strong division within the anti-fascist, that the anti-fascist camp that had some legacies in the years after the end of the Spanish Civil War. And those legacies were global legacies. They had an impact also in the exile communities. I've studied the case of Spain, of France, and the former members of the international brigades that have been put in French camp, and that had some very tough time among them during this split. On the other hand, it was thanks to the Spanish Civil War and to its global dimension that it became clear for many anti-fascists all around the world. I know that this could sound contradicting from the thing that I've just said, but I think I'm quite convinced about that. It's that the Spanish Civil War was a changing experience for all the international anti-fascist movement, because people from all around the world say that there was the possibility of action against fascism and the possibility of connection and collaboration between different national anti-fascist movements. The most clear example for everyone was the international brigades. So, and I think it's not the case that the anti-fascist activity became more successful in Mexico after 1939, after the arrival of some veterans, of some Italian veterans of the international brigades, after the arrival of the Spanish exiles, and so on. So this is one of the elements that I'd like to ask to Daniel, if he see also this, the Spanish Civil War has such a changing moment for the history of anti-fascism. And the other element that I would like to comment, and it's something that I started to think about when you were doing your PhD, and it's something that re-emerged when I read the draft that you circulated the other day with us, and it's something that re-emerged today during your presentation. I mean, doing global transnational history, it's speaking about connection and integration. So if we look at this Italian community using these two categories, we see, and correct me if I'm wrong, because it's something that I'm just thinking about, so I would like to share these ideas with you also. So when we are speaking about connections, meaning the connection that those exiles were maintaining with other exile communities, especially in Latin and Northern America, we are speaking mainly about national connections, because they were maintaining connection with other Italian exile communities that were present in other big cities. The theme of the cities, it's another central element. If I'm not wrong, Hugo wrote something about that. Now that anti-fascism developed in its transnational and global way thanks to this big hub, because people tend to make their own exile in big cities. I mean, we have the most classical example in Europe, that it's Paris. So we have this, but I'm not. I mean, so let's go back to the connections. So we have this transnational connection that those exiles were maintaining, but mainly with other Italian exiles. And then we have the integration. So the way that in which those people try to integrate within the local community. And in this case, we have a more transnational story, because they tried to have contacts and to have collaboration with, starting with Vicente Lombardo Toledano and all the movement beyond him, and entering in contact with other national communities of exiles and so on. So we have this national connections, transnational connection, and while on the other hand, we had this integration in Mexico City that was maybe the real transnational part of this history. And a very last comment, and very last, but this is something because that I started to investigate in the last years, and what it could be very interesting and would add more value, I think, to your. I think you are in the process of transforming your PhD into a book, so maybe there is still room if we have if you want to add something. But what it can add a real value to your investigation is also to look at this community that you have mentioned in this presentation of radicals, exiles from other parts of Latin America who were living at that same time in Mexico City. Because if we look at Mexico City after 1945, it became a real transnational hub of exiles proceeding from all around Latin America. So from where Fidel Castro started to organize his invasion, is going back to Cuba, from Mexico City, collaborating with former members of the Spanish Republican Army. So if we look at Mexico City, and there has been some very good articles in the last years, Mexico City after 1945 was no longer this very important hub for anti-fascism, because there was no need anymore to have an anti-fascism, since more or less in Europe we had solved this problem, even if, I mean, with the exception of Spain and Portugal, but it remained a transnational hub for radicals. In that case of Latin American radicals that were starting to think how to overthrow their own dictatorship in their own states. And I think there has been a sort of maybe, I don't know, but this is something that it's still to investigate, but there has been for sure some level of contact between those radicals who were already living in Mexico City during the Second World War, for example, and those big communities of European anti-fascists. I think I've said more or less everything that I wanted to say. I'm sorry if I've been a bit chaotic, but that's all. Thank you.
No. Thank you. Thank you very much for all these suggestions and ideas. I asked Daniel, we would prefer to have also the comments by Hugo Garcia Fernandez, and then you can reply to both if you agree.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay for you? Okay.
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much. So please, Hugo Garcia Fernandez, you have the floor, and we wait for your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I think that the order that you have decided is the right one, because I will repeat some of the things that my colleague Enrico Acciai has mentioned, starting by thanking you and the center for the invitation, and also Dr. Goldstein for an interesting paper in article, and also Dr. Acciai for the pleasure of meeting him again, even if it's been a long time, even if it's online. And I hope that we manage to find each other, really somewhere soon. Okay, this is a very broad project, covers a very long ground, chronologically, and also in terms of the range of groups which are discussed. And I really didn't know much about Italian anti-fascism in Mexico, so I've discovered many things I didn't know, and I think it's convincing regarding the diversity of this exile, the way that it depended on the changing local political scene, very, very changing, and I think it's it pays attention to that. Its close connections to other political movements, other exile communities, its inner divisions, and the consequent difficulties of unitary groups, such as the Garibaldi, to try to achieve a real unità antifascista. Even though these divisions did not prevent the group from achieving other maybe secondary aims, which are also well emphasized, such as its propaganda, its networks, and its contribution to the welfare of exiles, for instance. So I've found these aspects of the text interesting and also convincing, and I also agree with some of the conclusion of its Dr. Goldstein's article on study storage, which seems to be very much connected to this short presentation, on the fact that the Garibaldi cannot be in principle summarized as a mere Comintern satellite or a stooge, or this kind of Cold War very simplistic characterization. So I agree with all that. I repeat, I'm not a specialist on this, not even on transnational anti-fascism, but so my comment will be, unlike Dr. Acciai's, a more external commentary. So I'm trying to find ways in which this article can be more than a mere contribution to filling a gap in the literature on Italian anti-fascist exile. So I begin with the justification of the art. Maybe thinking about the ways in which this research and the wider book project that has been announced, that I'm looking forward to reading, can be a more substantial contribution, or at least can be explicitly justified as a more substantial contribution to different debates within the anti-fascist studies community, which is a growing community. One is just from the marketing point of view, if you allow me, I would go beyond merely starting with the question that there was a gap, a specific gap within this very specific exile community, which is it's perfectly okay, and I'm convinced that there was a gap, and a gap obviously needs to be filled. But if we could reframe maybe this research in the context, in a wider context, the context of the literature on the Italian anti-fascist exile, or also besides anti-fascist exile in Mexico. So I'm suggesting that Dr. Goldstein engages with a wider debate and goes beyond and tries to frame his contribution for a wider audience. And of course, this requires doing something that is announced and that it's done, but could be done maybe more with more insistence, comparing and exploring the transnational dimension. For instance, describing the geography of Italian anti-fascist exile, and maybe, of course, the the communities that are more relevant here. And for instance, maybe I've read superficially, but I feel that Argentina, for instance, could be explored. Italian anti-fascist exiles in Argentina could play a larger role here, because obviously this was a larger community. And this is a comparison that, for instance, Andrea Acciai made, and in a very interesting way a few years ago, and that could also allow the author to explore the influence of different environments. For instance, Andrea Acciai explained or made clear the fact that for German anti-fascist exiles, Mexico and Argentina were different environments, among other things, because in Mexico, anti-fascism was a state anti-fascism under Cárdenas, and also differently, but also to a large extent under Ávila Camacho. Whereas in Argentina, it was more of what she calls a civil society affair, and therefore the strategies to integrate, as Enrico Acciai has put it, which is a very good way to phrase it, were obviously different, necessarily different, because the complicity of the state could not be taken for granted in Argentina in the same way as in Mexico. So this is one thing in which one way in which I think that the article could be stretched by comparing this relatively small, relatively peripheral, even though obviously significant communities, to other communities, both in other South American countries or Latin American countries. I suggest Argentina, which is also mentioned as one of the places where the Garibaldi had created networks, and also maybe previous communities. And I'm thinking about something, a community in a group that Enrico Acciai knows very well, which are the Justicia Libertà. And this is one question. The way in which the Garibaldi, the Alianza Garibaldi, tried to promote a unitary approach tried to promote anti-fascist unity in the context of the Second World War, reminded me of similar attempts by the Justicia Libertà, Rosselli, and others in the same circle at the beginning and during most of the Spanish Civil War. Interestingly, under the same banner of Garibaldinismo, and it is very interesting how Garibaldi, the figure, the concept of Garibaldinismo, suggests was used in the context of anti-fascist, classic anti-fascism as a byword for unity, for anti-fascist unity. So this is one question. What could the Garibaldi, the Mexican Garibaldi, could they be compared to the same, let's say, romantic supra-party approach, unitary approach of the socialist liberal Justicia Libertà? This is maybe one of the things that I'm curious to know whether, because obviously this affects one relevant question, which is the degree to which these Garibaldini of Mexican Garibaldini are original in the context of the long history of Italian anti-fascism. Okay, so these are some of the things that I was curious to learn more about. I'm not sure that in some of the things which could maybe make a more convincing case for the importance or important contribution of the Italian the Garibaldini, and specifically Italian anti-fascists in Mexico to the history of both Italian anti-fascism and foreign anti-fascism in Mexico. The ways in which they try to integrate the fact that they redefined, as Dr. Goldstein puts it, their fight as part of a broader struggle and so on, I find interesting but not so original. I think the anti-fascists, all anti-fascists did pretty much a similar effort to translate their values, their projects, and their claims into local languages. And I think that this is has been explored very convincingly, especially by specialists on Latin American anti-fascism, such as Andrés Bisso and Andrea Acciai as well, when they have explored concepts such as Creole fascism and so on. And Andrea Acciai also has explored the way in which German anti-fascists try to connect with the legacy of the Mexican Revolution. So I'm not so sure that that is a specific a peculiarity or a very significant aspect. But of course, the significant contributions could be more clearly understood if we if Dr. Goldstein explored, and again here I'm repeating Enrico Acciai's comments, explore maybe more or especially the connections of Italian anti-fascists to other exile communities. And I think that this is for me, this is the more interesting, the more interesting aspect of his topic is both the way in which his protagonists were connected to both Italian anti-fascists in other countries, and also to foreign anti-fascists in Mexico. And for instance, I've been and I'm curious to know more about some international initiatives, such as the first Anti-Fascist Congress of Acción Democrática Internacional, or the Federación de Residentes Anti-Nazi-Fascistas Extranjeros in Mexico. These were groups I knew nothing about, and seem very, very interesting topics. In order to summarize, these are some of the things I would like to know more about. I would also like to know more about the social. I understand that the social demographic background that is described of the activists that is described in the study strategy article, and it wasn't on today's presentation, but will be on the book. And I think that it should be on the book from the beginning, because one could argue that maybe the social origin of these anti-fascists might be connected to their, in some ways, in principle, to their approach, to their goals, their specific approaches to anti-fascism. not only from the point of view of strategies, which are the focus of this article, but also from a broader point of view regarding political culture, regarding a more cultural, let's say, cultural turn approach to anti-fascism, which is something that I would also like to know more about. Aspects such as the spaces of sociability of these activists, their commemorations, and some of them are mentioned here, but I would like to know. I think that this could be potentially enlarged. The 20th September, the Battle of Guadalajara, and everything that connects to their identity as both anti-fascists, Italians, and also activists interested in both the past and the future of Italy and the world. So, and of course, you could go on by exploring, their attitudes to religion, to gender, to many other things that are maybe to even the Mexican Revolution, the realities of Mexican society, natives, the kind of things that are on the focus of research of, in both anti-fascism and other. And finally, so in order to rephrase this as a question, well, the last question, what I would like to know is to what extent there is a very intriguing sentence. As Leo Valiani recalled in 1982, exile provided the anti-fascists with meaningful political and international experience that would have been impossible to obtain in fascist Italy. Well, as Enrico Acciai was mentioning, the Spanish Civil War was a defining, transformative experience for volunteers, well, those who survived, obviously. But I'm also interested in how did this group of Italian exiles affect initiatives in Mexico, but also how did Mexico affect the future of these exiles? So what did they learn? What kind of transfers came from this experience for these exiles, both individually and also as actors in post-war Italy? And that is maybe the second question. I've talked too much, but I've made a couple of questions, and I'm interested in both things. A couple of details. I'm not sure that Carlos Esplá, I've known Carlos Esplá as a left Republican. I'm not sure that he was ever a socialist. This is a very, very academic detail, but just for the record. And also, I'm interested in knowing, I've been intrigued by the US files that are some of the sources that are explored here and very interesting, but also could there be any relevant files from the other end of the spectrum by the Mexican Communist Party or maybe the Comintern? How did the Comintern view this group, which is the protagonist of your research, the Garibaldini? Was it a potentially usable group? Or through Vidali, for instance, or was it a group that was truly seen as an independent and group that could not be manipulated? From the point of view of the Mexican Communist Party, maybe rather than the Comintern for chronological reasons. And so thank you very much. That is all.
Thank you. Thank you very much for so many very interesting, and the questions. I'm even happier than this seminar could be useful to Daniel for his forthcoming book, which we are all waiting for. So please, Daniel, if you want to reply to your discussants, you have time.
Well, first, let me say thank you to you both. It's a great pleasure to be able to interact with two leading scholars on the transnational anti-fascist movement, and this gives me a lot to work on, which is really helpful. Over here in Chicago, I'm a little bit excluded from some of this discussion. For various reasons. Let me go through, and I took some notes and try to go more or less in order. So I'll respond first to the comments of Professor Acciai. I would say, yes, I agree with the idea that the Spanish Civil War was in some ways a watershed for the Italian anti-fascist movement in Mexico, like it was elsewhere. Certainly the fracture that occurred in Spain at the end of the Civil War, the Hechos de Mayo, all these other things, the legacies of this were certainly present. I know that Vidali himself, one of the protagonists of the Garibaldi, was believed to have been involved in some unsavory deeds with his own hands. This, of course, being exacerbated by the arrival of Trotsky himself in the country, right? That also is another major fracture point that reinforces, I suppose, the divisions that were already there, and in some way requires Mexican leftists to take somewhat of a position on the issue. Lombardo Toledano was clearly very strongly against the idea of giving refuge to Trotsky, whereas some others, Diego Rivera, was certainly on the other side. The idea of a sort of transformational experience that conferred the possibility of action, even from those outside of Italy, but far away. The extent to which, after the Civil War, they felt more empowered to act. I think that is also true. Some of the case, I mean, it's also important to remember, however, that they were quite isolated in Mexico. There was no real opportunity to physically travel. There was some communication by letter, but it was pretty. They were in some ways pretty isolated. Although they did try to act in other ways. An interesting example that I left out of the presentation for reasons of time was that the Garibaldi contacted, I believe this is in 1942, contacts Lombardo Toledano and asks for his help in attempting to save Luigi Longo, who they believe life may be in danger in prison. And Lombardo Toledano responds by sending telegrams, which I have copies of, to labor leaders in Santiago, Chile, and in Buenos Aires, demanding mass labor demonstrations in front of the Italian embassies of those countries. I wasn't able to confirm that those demonstrations actually took place, but I do have the communication on behalf of Toledano requesting them. So I think that is a way in which they did see that they were able to, through this transnational web of characters, able to try to influence what was going on. In terms of, we talk connections and integration, and you talk about connections with other Italian exiles in other countries, which would be then, I suppose, you call national connections, and also more transnational connections with locals and with other immigrants. And I think you're right to stress the importance of cities. In the Mexican case, it was very much the case. The Garibaldi, while I didn't have time to really mention, it did form about 8 or 10 sections around the world. One in Switzerland, several in other Latin American countries, but they really failed inside Mexico itself to establish themselves anywhere outside the capital. There was a failed attempt in the town of Rio Blanco, which is an industrial center, which had seen a bunch of strikes even prior to the Mexican Revolution. And there was another attempt up by the U.S. border in Mexicali, but this was also a failure. But I think one thing should, in the Mexican case, also just be remembered, and that's that a lot of Italians were forced to move out of coastal areas and border areas. This was, as part of the hemispheric design for security. They were able to, the Mexican government was able to forcibly relocate Italian nationals, and the capital was almost always the destination. I think you're absolutely right that there should be more attention to radicals from other parts of Latin America. I'm not really an expert on this subject, but you do see the participation of these individuals come up throughout the entire 20 years or so that I'm studying here. An early example is in the Alianza Antifascista that I was talking about in the early years. There, I believe the inaugural issue of Italia Libre, which unfortunately I don't have, and I have to sort of interpret it through the fascist notes, but it does apparently include the participation of the I believe Peruvian Victor Raúl Aya de la Torre, who was a pretty well-known intellectual at the time. And then as you get into the war years, you do also have for example, the Acción Democrática Internacional is led by a Costa Rican called Cordero Amador, and there are a number of other such connections. Unfortunately, one of the difficult things about this research is there is no, for example, Justicia y Libertad has an archive in Florence. The Alianza Garibaldi does not. There's no Fondo Garibaldi, Alianza Garibaldi, nor is there a Francesco Frola's papers are not really collected anywhere. So I've tried to sort of reconstruct who he was in contact with, primarily by downloading a whole bunch of finding aids from archives with people that I think he may have talked to, and then doing Control F and putting his name in there. And you do find there are a few other cases of Central and South American radicals. And I think that well, there's also, in fact, if you go back to the beginning of the period, there's some influence from the United States, what they call the slackers, right? The people the sort of US radicals that didn't want to participate in the First World War and went to Mexico. And there are some, if you look at the sort of early milieu in which these anti-fascists were operating, such as Tina Modotti, for example, you do get some of these names. So that's sort of what I have in my notes here. Did I respond more or less? Okay. All right. So I want to first of all thank again Dr. Garcia. This is obviously a very welcome bit of constructive criticism that I think will help me make this book much more useful and ideally more marketable. What I'm in the process now of is trying to primarily cut things out, trying to go from 375-page thesis down to about a 220-page book. But I do see a lot of things in here that are obviously going to need to be included in if I hope to justify it. Because no, I fully acknowledge that this strategy that the Garibaldi and others used to sort of redefine their their struggle. No, it was not. It was certainly not unique. That's why I brought up the example of Acciai and Lombardo Toledano with the Germans. Let me see what's. Oh, so the idea of comparing the Mexican exile with others, I like that idea. What I'm sort of struggling with is to pick exactly where I should do more comparison with which countries, and I obviously welcome your suggestion of Argentina. I sort of, at least in the thesis, I sort of shied away from that largely because a lot of it has been done. I mean, there's a lot of good work on it. I would like to establish more what actual connections existed between anti-fascists in Argentina and those in Mexico. There is some interesting work by Fanesi on a character called Albano Cornelli, who was a communist and then an ex-communist, and he was at the head of a number of projects, some of which I believe dialogued with the Garibaldi. It's interesting also how you emphasize the difference between a sort of civil society affair in Argentina and a more state-sanctioned environment in Mexico. I think that's interesting. I imagine that would be a similar case when comparing it perhaps with Brazil. I find I don't read Portuguese, so I've sort of shied away from attempting too much into Brazil. I've also seen some interesting things about Canada, which I was looking into a little bit. It was a similarly sized exile to that in Mexico. There's an interesting article from about 30 years ago. I can't remember off the top of my head the name of the author, but she analyzed all the files in the Casellario Politico Centrale that talked about Canada, and there were certainly, I remember noting some similarities with the Mexican case. I like how you compare Giustizia e Libertà to the Alianza Garibaldi. It's something that I sort of hadn't really thought of, largely because the individuals who had participated in Giustizia e Libertà mostly flowed into the Mazzini Society, right? Mostly Alberto Tarchiani, Alberto Cianca. These were mostly people that had participated in Giustizia e Libertà, Leo Valiani to some extent, although mostly on the quiet. So I see those people. When I think of Giustizia e Libertà, I think of the other side of this debate. I think of them as being sort of Mazzini Society and Italia Libre allies or inspiration. But I do think that you're right to see sort of similar tactics. And I appreciate you pointing this out, because I was sort of perhaps blind to that, because I was sort of viewing those people as sort of antagonists to the Garibaldi. Some of you mentioned that these are interesting organizations, the FRAIM and the Acción Democrática Internacional. I too am trying to look more into these. They don't have a whole lot of. There's very little historiography done on these. I do have a copy of the full program of the first Anti-Fascist Congress that was done by the ATI in 1942. I believe it was actually Andrea Ackley who gave me that. So she's also looked into it, but I don't think anyone's really written anything. There is and I could send you the link if I could find it. There is someone did a presentation on it some years ago, and it's on YouTube. I could send you that. I could certainly find it. Some of these other ones though, like the FRAIM and this thing, the Sociedad de Amigos de la Unión Soviética, I've really only been able to find very little information on them, and I am looking for more. Generally, what I've found has been in the Department of State Central Decimal files, where they are sort of, it's US informants that are more or less informed, trying to recount what happened and who's who and give a play-by-play. So these things are probably ripe for more investigation on their own right. I would like to integrate them certainly more into my work. I don't know if I'm sufficiently expert in the Mexican political system to investigate them myself. There's actually some reference to these also in Aribert Ryman's very long book, Transnational District. So I do want to also respond to your question about how did Mexico affect the exile's future? And one interesting case is that of Mario Montagnana, who was a relatively senior member of the Italian Communist Party, who was in Mexico for about 4 years. He was one of the main 4 members of the Garibaldi, and he did. When he went back to Italy, I know one of his roles in the party was editing a number of different newspapers. And he did have, and if you look at them, and I did do some of that, there is a lot, he maintained a lot of connections with Lombardo Toledano. And Lombardo Toledano did come to Europe, and Montagnana would meet with him, and he definitely lent some support to Montagnana over the years. The other case that I'm trying to get deeper into, and that's why I was lucky enough to receive a small grant to go to the Kiel Center at Cornell University and do some research into the Italian American labor unions. And primarily I was in the papers of, got back last week, in the papers of Luigi Antonini. And he had the Italian American Labor Council, and he was also the head of the Local 89 of the International Ladies Garment Worker Union. And he was involved, and I'm doing a little reading on that too. There is some historiography on the subject from back in the late 80s, early 90s. He was involved with funneling monies to non-communist socialists in Italy in the 1946, 1947, 1948 period. One of his main points of contact that you see there is Giuseppe Faravelli, who was not in Mexico, but he also does support things through Leo Valiani, and I found some correspondence between them. The extent to which that connection was built during Valiani's time in Mexico, I don't have any evidence that it was, although I do think when you even someone like Valiani, who was only in Mexico for about 18 months, when you look at his correspondence, you see an evolution as he becomes more comfortable with the politics of the Western Hemisphere and of the United States. When he first arrives in Mexico, he starts reaching out to American progressive intellectuals, proposing books on Arturo Labriola and all these other things. And he writes to them in French, and, it doesn't go all that well. By the time he gets back, he claims to speak English reasonably well. He has established contacts with a fair number of characters in the sort of democratic U.S. left, John Dewey, Sidney Hook, Dwight McDonald, and a few others. So I think they did form connections that they hoped then to use later. And I think they also sort of developed a familiarity with the United States and the Western Hemisphere that they might not otherwise have had. I very much appreciate your correction on Carlos Esplá. I will make note of that. With regard to the U.S. files, you made a mention about that. I will say that it is a very, very difficult archive to do research in. I started during COVID doing some research there, and I did it by essentially paying an expert to help me because I couldn't get to Washington. It was COVID, and he was doing it from there, and I was able to get some a number of documents that way. But I think there's a lot more there. It's hard to tease it out. I went to Washington in the fall of 2022, actually, at the request of Professor Kamuri, and dug out some files that he was interested in, and found a bunch of other things. And I think that the Office of Strategic Services is particularly useful for their observation of sort of transnational anti-fascists, both in the United States and in Mexico. As far as the Comintern, I did do some searching. I know Professor Acciai pointed me towards some websites where you can do some basic searching and detect the existence of files, and I have detected the existence of files on about 15 or 20 of the individuals that I've studied. I haven't yet managed to get my hands on those, nor do I speak Russian, but I'm hoping to actually get to see that. Unfortunately, the Mexican Communist Party archives are essentially a disaster. There's very little left of it. I believe that they would be at a place called CEMOS, which is the Centro de Estudios de Movimientos Obreros, something like this. I'm not exactly sure the acronym, but I was in touch with them, and they did indicate to me that a lot of the files had been lost and destroyed, I think some of which during the government repression of those years. Also, it's not generally very easy to search. Attempting to glean from other sources how the Comintern and communist parties viewed these individuals, everything I'm doing is secondhand. There's an interesting comment from Onofrio Papagallo in the opening of his book on the Italian Communist Party in Latin America, where he stresses that that the communist parties of the Western Hemisphere really did not help the Garibaldi in any meaningful way. I went to, and I was able to look at some reports in the Fondazione Gramsci, where you can see reports made from Mario Montagnana and from Mexico, who had been in Mexico when he got back to Italy, and from Giuseppe Berti, and they sort of reinforced this idea that there was a fair amount of friction between themselves and the at least the communists in the United States and in Mexico as well, I would say. One of the interesting topics, which I think deserves more exploration, although it's perhaps a little outside of the scope of this project itself, is the idea that the Earl Browder, for one, was very much a proponent of the idea of Americanization of the workers, that the old world little internal fights have to be left behind, and the workers need to Americanize. The Italian communists in the United States, and I believe also in Mexico, were against this idea. They thought, wait a minute, you're letting the fascists be the only ones to speak to this immigrant mass in Italian in the name of Italy. So this was an important divergence between communists in the New World and those who were transplanted from Italy. So that ends what I noted down. Hopefully, I've responded to most of what you said, and I'm very, very thankful for the input.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel. And yes, I asked the two discussants if they have something to add to the reply.
A very short note, if you allow me, because it's just
Sure.
the last topic that Dr. Goldstein has mentioned. It just came to my mind that Sandra Pujals from Puerto Rico has done very valuable work on interwar communism in the Caribbean Basin. From the Caribbean Bureau of the Comintern, and so she has written both in Spanish and in English, including a chapter on a book which you probably know, edited by Casper Brasken, Nigel Copsey, and David Featherstone, which is called Antifascism in a Global Perspective. And Sandra Pujals is one of the contributors, and she does. She might know, some of the whereabouts of the sources that you're interested in, to get to some idea about common visions of the kind of people that later formed the Garibaldi Alliance. So just came to my mind. She might be worth both reading and maybe getting in touch with.
Well, thank you very much. I do have it, and so I have seen it. I should probably reread that. If I'm not mistaken, that deals mostly with the earlier period of the exile. So that a few of the people that, and I didn't really get into this, and I don't want to go on too long, but there were one of the ways that the Garibaldi, I think, was more successful than some of the other attempts at anti-fascist organization in Mexico was that they did draw upon people who had been in Mexico already a long time. So when I looked at I was able to identify about close to 50 members by name and demographic of the sort of 100 to 150 that probably existed. And of those, I could say probably the majority had been in Mexico for 10 years at the time of the founding. So I think that none of them were the titular heads of it, but the participation did have a pretty long-standing presence in Mexico, and thus some pretty strong connections with the local population. So some of those people would have been present during the time that Sandra Pujols wrote about. So I'm definitely going to investigate that further.
Well, thank you very much. So at this point, we promised to keep the seminar to the 2 hours. So it reminds me the pleasure to thank you for your participation. Thank you to Daniel for his presentation, and thank you to both discussants for their very insightful questions and comments. And see you very soon. We have a third seminar in March 5. So you are all invited to attend the seminar. Thank you very much, and have a very good evening and good day, of course, for that.
Thank you.